He took it himself. Not through a clubhouse attendant. Not through an intermediary delivering an organizational message with the professional distance that institutions prefer when the message is difficult. Dave Roberts walked into that dugout, looked at Tanner Scott, and held out his hand. And Tanner Scott, still breathing hard, still carrying the specific physical weight of 6 runs surrendered in a single appearance, still wearing the uniform that had just witnessed one of the worst outings of his professional career, pulled the jersey over his head and handed it to his manager. The suspension came after 5 games. Official. Announced through the proper channels with the procedural language that organizations use when a decision has been made at the highest level and is not subject to negotiation or appeal within the internal structure. But the jersey came first. And what happened between the moment Roberts held out his hand and the moment Scott handed it over, what was said, what was revealed, what broke open in a dugout that had seen difficult moments before but had never quite seen this, is the story that the baseball world spent the next 72 hours trying to fully understand. The 6 runs arrived with the specific cruelty that baseball reserves for pitchers who are already struggling. Not all at once, which would have been painful but survivable in the way that one catastrophic inning is sometimes survivable, absorbed as an anomaly rather than a confirmation. They came in pieces. Over the course of an appearance that extended longer than it should have because the decision to pull Scott came 3 batters later than the moment the decision should have been made. The first run scored on a pitch that started as a slider and finished as something else entirely, flatter, slower, arriving in the zone without the late break that makes a slider a weapon rather than a target. The hitter didn't need to do anything special. He simply waited for the ball to arrive at the location it was heading and made contact with the comfortable authority of someone who had seen the pitch far too early. The second and third came on a fastball that the radar gun clocked at a velocity that, 3 months ago, would have represented a down day for Scott. Now it represented what he had. The hitter recognized it immediately and didn't miss it. By the time the 4th run scored, by the time the full scope of what was happening in that inning had become impossible to watch with anything other than the specific, uncomfortable empathy that baseball people feel when a professional is publicly suffering, something in the dugout had changed. The energy had shifted from concern to something more complicated. Ohtani had been watching. He watches everything. That quality, the completeness of his attention during games he is not directly involved in, the way he processes what he sees with the same analytical depth he brings to his own preparation, is something that his teammates have described consistently enough that it has become part of the organizational understanding of who he is. He had been watching Scott all night. Not with judgment. The distinction matters and the people who were present that night are consistent on this point. He was not watching with the critical detachment of a superstar evaluating a teammate's failure. He was watching with the concentrated attention of someone trying to understand something. Trying to identify something specific in what he was seeing that would explain what he was watching. By the 4th run, he had found it. He moved down the dugout to where Scott was sitting between batters. What he said, reconstructed through accounts from 3 separate players who were within hearing distance, was not long. It was not a speech. It carried none of the formal weight of advice being delivered from a position of superiority. It was a question. He said, "When did you stop trusting the pitch?" Scott looked at him. Ohtani said, "You're releasing it differently. Like you're trying to guide it instead of throw it." When did that start? Scott didn't answer immediately. Then the 5th run scored and Roberts was already moving toward the dugout steps. Roberts took the jersey in a single, decisive motion that left no room for ambiguity about what it meant. He didn't explain it in that moment. He didn't offer context or organizational language or any of the cushioning that difficult messages sometimes receive when they are delivered in public spaces where witnesses are present and emotions are raw. He held out his hand. Scott pulled off the jersey. And then he did something that nobody expected. Something that converted a moment of organizational discipline into something more complicated and more human than a 5-game suspension and a confiscated uniform. He tore it. Not completely, the jersey did not come apart in his hands. But with enough force, and with enough deliberate intent, that the fabric gave in a way that was visible to everyone watching, and that made the sound that fabric makes when it is forced past its tolerance. And then he said something. What Scott said in that moment, in the raw, unmanaged honesty of a professional athlete at the end of a terrible outing with a torn jersey in his hands and a 5-game suspension materializing around him, was not directed at Roberts. It was not directed at the organization. It was not the defensive outburst of someone deflecting accountability outward. It was directed inward. He said, "I don't know how to throw it anymore." 6 words. The room, or rather the dugout, the specific compressed space of a baseball dugout where sound travels differently than in open air, absorbed those 6 words with the silence they deserved. He said, "I stand on that mound and I know exactly what I'm supposed to do, and my body won't do it. I can feel it happening wrong while it's happening. I can feel the release point drift, and I know it's drifting and I can't stop it. I can't stop it." He stopped. Then said, "That's what's been happening. That's the truth." Muncy revealed the rest of it. Max Muncy had been in that dugout. Had been present for the Scott outing, for the jersey moment, for the 6 words that opened the door on something the organization had not fully understood was happening inside one of its pitchers. He spoke about it in a post-game session that began as a standard availability and became something more when a reporter asked him directly what the atmosphere in the dugout had been like during Scott's appearance. Muncy said, "I want to be honest about this because I think honesty is what the situation deserves and what Tanner deserves. What's been happening with him is not a stuff issue. We've all seen the stuff. The stuff is still there. What's been happening is something harder to see from outside." He said, "Tanner has been fighting something mechanical that got into his head. A release point problem that started small and grew because the more he tried to fix it the more he felt it. And the more he felt it the more he tried to fix it. And somewhere in that cycle the physical problem became a mental one, and the mental one became something that was sitting on him in every outing." A reporter asked, "Did the organization know the extent of it?" Muncy said, "I think they knew there was a problem. I don't think anyone fully knew what Tanner just told us in that dugout. I think Tanner didn't fully know he was going to say it until he said it." He paused. Then said, "Sometimes a jersey getting taken away opens something up. Sometimes losing the thing you've been hiding behind is what lets the truth out." But Roberts added something to the official statement that was not standard. A single sentence at the end that arrived after the formal language of the suspension notification, like something personal appended to something official. He said, "During this period, Tanner Scott will work with our pitching staff on the specific mechanical issue he identified. This is not purely disciplinary. It is corrective. We believe in what he is capable of when the delivery is right. The suspension exists because standards must be maintained. The work exists because we are not done with Tanner Scott." That sentence, "We are not done with Tanner Scott," traveled further than any other part of the announcement. Ohtani spoke about it briefly. Not in a formal availability. In the informal margins of a practice session, in the kind of exchange that happens when a reporter is positioned correctly and a player is in the right mood for honesty. He was asked what he had felt watching Scott's outing. He said, "Recognition. I have felt what he is describing. Every pitcher has felt some version of what he is describing. The moment when the body and the mind stop agreeing about what the pitch is supposed to do." He said, "The difference is that most pitchers feel it and try to hide it. Tanner said it out loud. In front of his team. That takes something that is harder than throwing a good fastball." He paused. Then said, "I think he's going to be fine. I think saying it was the beginning of being fine." A reporter asked, "Did your question in the dugout, about trusting the pitch, did that help open that door?" Ohtani considered this. Then said, "I asked him a question. He answered it honestly. That was all him." He picked up his glove and walked back to work.